Welcome back to Real Talk with Susan Stone and Kristina Supler. We are full-time moms and attorneys bringing our student defense legal practice to life with real, candid conversations. So today, Kristina and I are going to share a little news with all our listeners out there. We have a book coming out.
Yay! Long work in progress.
Yeah, we started. Did we start 2019 or 2020?
Oh my gosh, I don't even know.
Well, I think we started. Oh, sorry.
No, Debbie, ladies and gentlemen, audience listeners, our guest today is our co-author, who we're so happy to have join us, Dr. Debby Herbenick. Debbie, before I read some interesting background information, do you remember when we started down the path of the book?
Start the book?
I think we started writing. It was in 2021, but we started dreaming about it before the pandemic.
That's what I thought. It was right before the pandemic or like March of 2020. But
geez, now that it's done and our book, which we'll talk about, can be found. It's on pre-sale for Amazon. I didn't know how long it actually took to write a book. And Kristina, I am so grateful that I was ignorant about the process and just sort of did it.
Yeah, because otherwise I don't know that I would have. And our fine guest, Dr. Herbenick,
has written many.
So was very familiar with the process, and we were pushing things along and urgent and eager. Let's go. And Debbie's like, it's going to be a little bit of a journey, ladies.
I had no idea. So without further ado, Kristina, why don't we do the more formal introduction so everybody knows who we teamed up with?
Yes. So we are really happy to be joined today by Dr. Debby Herbenick, who is an internationally recognized sexual and reproductive health professor, researcher, and educator.
Not bad for us hitching our wagon over there, huh?
I'd say that we found the pro in this field. She is a provost professor at the Indiana University School of Public Health and director of the Center for Sexual Health Promotion. And for more than 20 years now, Debbie's dedicated her efforts to understanding how people experience their bodies and sexual lives. And truly, it was such a pleasure working with you, Debbie, and co-authoring this book with you. And
wait, we got to do a drum roll before you talk about the title of the book. Ready? And I don't know if you guys can hear this.
Oh, there you go.
Did that work?
That was good.
Okay, now that you got a drum roll, introduce the book.
The book is Yes, Your Kid. So welcome, Debbie. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Oh, and it's good to see you. How would you describe our book to our listeners who probably don't know a thing about it? Because actually it's our first discussion. We've waited.
I often think of our book, Yes, Your Kid, as being a bit of a catch-up, a sex education catch-up for parents that addresses what sex is really like today for young people. Whether young people are thinking about having sex, already having sex, hearing their friends talk about, this world of dating and hookups and sexuality. But this book really addresses contemporary sex and what parents need to know in order to have more informed conversations with their kids.
I have to ask, and this is overtly a shameless plug.
I love when you're shameless. People, you never get to see the shameless side of Kristina Supler. So go for it.
Thank you. Know that I have your blessing. Debbie, why should parents buy this book? Why is this something that parents need, on their bookshelf with a ton of other books?
Yeah, I really do think parents need Yes, Your Kid on their bookshelves for several reasons. I mean, one, again, even if they have great parenting sex ed books on their shelves, and there are many on there, I think of Yes, Your Kid as being different because most of these other books were written in what we, think of as like the before times, right? Before the COVID pandemic, when young people started spending a lot more of their time online and all that entails. Before this rise in rough sex, where rough sex became really mainstream. Most schools and parents are not equipped for that. And so, so really, again, dealing with sex as it is today. This book is also unique because it includes your voices, in the book. And, something that I learned from you, and I'm sure we'll talk about this today, but you two deal with realities of when sex goes wrong. And lots of times sex and hookups go right and it's fine, or they go good enough, but sometimes they go really, really sideways. And you two see a lot of that. And something that I learned from working with you, and why I had you come and talk with my college students too, is, all of these little details that happen, where I actually think there's an opportunity for parents to step in and say, hey, don't do this thing, right? It often doesn't go well. Or, hey, this thing can be interpreted in that way, and you need to know that. So it gives parents also these very real world scenarios and stories to talk with their teenagers and college students about, so that they can help their kids navigate this really tricky terrain in hopefully safer, better ways.
This summer, my daughter got married in June, and I remarked after the wedding to Kristina that my daughter's 25. We never get the privilege of being around students who are happy, who are leading fulfilled, good relationships.
So true. I mean, and we talk about this a lot. And Debbie, we've had this discussion with you a bit at times as well. What our clients, our students who we're helping support day in and day out, generally are only with us because they're experiencing some form of crisis. And so I love what I do. I'm passionate about my work. And I know, Susan, you feel the same way. But unfortunately, it's a self-selecting population, and that we're not in a position to hear the good stories, the happy stories when things go well. And so, of course, it's sort of, I don't know, maybe it jades us a little, or we certainly at a minimum bring that lens to, how we have certain conversations about students and sexuality. But it's something that, these conversations, no matter what your personal view is, I think we always talk about, Susan, these conversations need to be had with parents and families and in schools.
And we see things from the perspective as advocates and looking at people and trying to decide who's credible, testing truth. And so we are fierce advocates for our clients. But I love what you said in that our voices are here, and that we combined with you, who had a very different voice.
At times.
But looking back, what would you say the biggest challenge for you was working with people involved in both the Title IX process on campus and in the criminal justice system and in civil suits when sex goes bad?
The biggest challenge?
Or difference?
I think difference. I think that, again, you're working with students on college campuses day in and day out. And you probably, I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, share with our listeners, you hear stories and have conversations that run the gamut of positive to negative, unfortunate experiences. Whereas we're generally hearing only the negative. And then we're lawyers. And let's face it, a lot of people don't like how lawyers think.
Well, we do think differently. And I'm interested in your perspective. And then I'd like to share what I thought during the process, which was so eye-opening.
Yeah, well, you can go first.
Oh, I didn't think. So for me, it was that I come from a place where I listen to our clients, and then what we try to do is poke holes in their case to build them up. We get them ready for their interviews. We get them ready for hearings. We put them through rigorous cross-examination internally. So because of that, I don't think I'm quite as willing to take things at face value. And I felt like it was a real learning experience to gain. You have a much more open posture than I think I do as a lawyer. I'm a little more jaded through the process.
What do you think, Debbie?
So I think that, and I work with a number of lawyers because I also do a lot of expert witness work, and so, but I'm not a lawyer. In my role as a researcher, however, a lot of what we do are interviews with people about their sexual lives. And I wouldn't say that we take things at face value, because the job of a researcher is to interrogate, and that's not in a bad way. I mean, it's really to kind of, I think of it as like turning around people's ideas and memories and feelings and thoughts. And what I love about interviewing people, we interview people of all ages, depending on the project, and other projects are just, young people specific, for example. But I love it because it's a process together. And maybe a thing that's different, like, you're talking about like practicing cross-examination for a very specific outcome, and you clearly want certain perspectives shown for cross-examination and for, these types of cases. And that's not the situation where we're interviewing. We're just trying to understand, like, what was this experience for somebody? What was it like? And often in a 60 to 90 minute interview, which is kind of a common length for research interviews, maybe 2 hours, even what somebody first presents to you, they can have these really fascinating insights within the course of a period of time, right? So, for example, it's not unusual for somebody to say, yeah, this thing that happened, like, it was fine, it was consensual. And as you talk through and you sort of, ask them what they thought about something, and maybe have them walk through what, like, the communication process was like. And it might be that 10 minutes later they say, I mean, it was consensual, but it didn't feel right. And here's why, right? And then, I mean, it might even, so our job is never to lead anyone in a certain place, because we do want to hear their perspective. But in asking certain questions about, like, sort of walk me through, your thought process, or walk me through the interaction, it's really common for people to have, like, their own insights into their experiences. So there are certainly different processes of interacting with people, but it's something I love about research is this opportunity that I have to if the interview is going well, they're essentially inviting the interviewer in to understand their perspective and their experience. So I get to try on lots of different experiences and perspectives to see things that maybe I would not have thought of that way. And that's a real joy in the research.
Well, it makes me think this discussion we're having about our different roles in the process, it's making me think about some trends of cases that we've encountered. And Debbie, working with you helped me sort of recognize, again, something that I was incorrect in my thinking about. And that was, I always think of Susan and myself working with students. We're on the front lines of the issues that are, rumbling through college campuses in terms of Title IX, consent, sexual experiences. And we noticed through the years, really, of working with you, some issues that were newer to us. And we're like, oh my gosh, we're having cases about this issue or that issue. And who knew? And you're like, my students have been talking about this for a couple of years now. And it seems like at times there was sort of, I don't want to say a lag, but some of what you're hearing about day in and day out from your students in your lectures and class and in, I imagine, papers and essays they're writing. Some of that information, and I guess, I don't know if trends is the right word, but
no, I think it's a funnel, Kristina. If you think about it, Debbie's going to hear about it first, and it isn't until something is perceived as a conflict or something that's reportable, and then people find us as advisors.
Or maybe just students learning about in our world, the Title IX process, that it seemed foreign or inapplicable, and through a discussion.
But even so, if you look at our cases, how many cases do we get where the actual incident occurred maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago?
Many.
So it's natural that Debbie would be the first line of information. And then when we get a scenario, there's definitely going to be what I call a funnel approach. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Debbie, about that?
I wish I was the first line of information, but I'm not. I can. Whoa. They are, right? I mean,
sure.
And that's
well, you're ahead of us.
Yeah, I'm early because like you said, I do get to hear their questions in class and read their They're essays. And that's, one of many reasons I love teaching, because I'm learning all the time from my students. Sex does change. And so when, it's really only hearing from them that I get to understand their questions. And then sometimes I say, this is kind of new and we need to learn about this. And I can't really help them as a professor if we don't actually do some of this research to figure it out. And that's how that came up with choking. I mean, I was hearing about choking from students, and other colleagues were hearing about it. And then back in, 2019, we decided, well, actually, we did our first study that included choking in 2016, but then really started focusing on it in research that started a little bit before the pandemic. And it's taken over our line of research. I mean, everyone calls it choking. For listeners who haven't heard of it before, it's technically strangulation. It involves using one or both hands to press or squeeze against the neck, sometimes forearms, sometimes ligatures. And, and I think this is right, again, where some of it, like we had different experiences with working with young people, because when I first heard about this, I mean, I was pretty shocked that this was becoming really normative. And I thought there's no way many people, especially young women, want this to be happening to them. And then we did the surveys and we interviewed, and we just found like massive numbers of people wanting it to be done to them. And that was a big surprise, right? But it's what the data has consistently shown us. Now, that also means, though, that, it doesn't mean that everyone wants it to happen to them, as we talk about in the book, as we talk about in Yes, Your Kid. And it doesn't mean that it always goes well, because even though it does go fine a lot of the time, and we can say what that means, because fine, I mean, in terms of consent, not in terms of health, right? There's health risks, even if it's consensual. But sometimes, and I know this comes up in your cases too, and we hear this pretty often in our research studies, somebody may seek out a partner to choke them, or they may accept somebody else wanting to choke them, but it's harder than they thought it was going to be. And it hurts them, or it scares them, or all of the above. And so, this is one of the really significant changes that we've seen in contemporary sex, because we're now in a place where 2/3 of young adult women in our college surveys report having ever been choked during sex. And that's a massive number. So, 15, 20 years ago, there was very little data on it, but the very little data that we had suggested probably just a few percent of adults were doing these types of, choking or other kinds of breath play. And now it's the norm. And so
you took my question, Debbie, because when we get choking cases, we used to call them choking cases. And now choking may or may not be one element of a case. And sometimes it's not even the main element.
Mm-hmm.
So would you call it more, it's not that everybody in college enjoys it or wants it, but it is considered normal in that it can be part of the normal discussion?
It is very much considered normative. And so, yeah, there are these rough sex behaviors, choking. And I probably focus the most on choking for two reasons. One, because it's far and away one of the most common, like way more common than slapping, than smothering, than consensual non-consent, than other forms of rough sex. Probably the only other one that's really, around as high in terms of prevalence is spanking, but spanking is not nearly as consequential for health, right?
Right.
And so to be choked is really different than to be spanked in terms of health and risk of injury or death. And so, yeah, I mean, these come in like constellations of rough sex behaviors, and choking just happens to be one of the most common, but it's also one of the most concerning in terms of risk of injury. And even though death is rare, it is a possible outcome, and nobody can tell somebody that what you're doing may or may not lead to someone's death. Like it's always a possibility, and people need to know about that.
So, Debbie, in the book, Yes, Your Kid, we write about, choking, rough sex. There's discussion about various forms of contraception. And Susan and I, again, we hear all sorts of stories all the time that make us say, okay, interesting perspective, not quite accurate in terms of, contraception and things like that. But it just sort of begs the question, in your opinion, do you feel or find that students are more confused than ever about sex than in medically and scientifically accurate information, or are they better informed and just struggling through complex issues?
I don't think there's ever been a time in our country when young adults have been very well informed about sex. But sex has changed, so it's different. The things people are confused about now are different than they were 10 years ago, and that's different than 20 or 30 years ago. But for many people who are now like in their 70s and 80s, who have been involved in our studies many times, and I've talked to just socially too, right? Some of those early misconceptions many of that generation will talk about are stories like, I can't count the number of times I've heard things like, well, my parents told me never to kiss anyone because, if you kiss somebody, then you wind up pregnant. So we did everything but kiss and we wound up pregnant. Right. And so there's like lots of these like older generation stories that like that was the misconception. A lot of things around pregnancy and certainly what women owed men in particular, like big issues around assault and like duty and obligation if somebody pays for your dinner and blah, blah, blah. So every generation has its misinformation and its misconceptions. But what we have now is just this complete lack of sex education in many U.S. states, not everywhere, but many places. But even the ones who really provide quite a bit of sex education, they're not talking about rough sex. They're not talking in detail about pornography and what young people need to know and figure out like what's real, what's not. A lot of what's shown in pornography is not at all real. And young people today are also living out their lives, with online media.
Online, yeah.
And that's totally different than 20 years ago. And yes, in some ways, there's a lot more information than there was before. But young people who we hear from like don't know which sites to trust or which influencer to trust. So there's a lot of information, but unless you're getting it from somebody who really has good information, then, it doesn't really do you any good.
Can I share a new observation that just happened today?
Sure.
This is crazy. So we're representing involved in a lot of same-sex couple matters of allegations of sexual assault. And when I grew up, if you said the word sex, I am having sex, that meant to me that the person was engaging in penetration, penile vaginal penetration. And if, not to get graphic, but we are talking about sex and we're talking about our book, Yes, You're a Kid, everything leading up to that, including oral sex,
Digital penetration.
Thank you, was foreplay. What's interesting is it occurred to me that what's defined as sex is changing.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a client who defines sex as digital penetration. We had sex. And I had to stop and say, could you tell me what that means? Help me understand, what does sex mean to you? And sexual assault, of course, is any contact without consent. But the word rape was used in context of that case. And again, in a criminal setting, rape is defined as penetration, however slight. It can be with a penis or an object or a finger, but there has to be penetration. And we're seeing not just one case, but many cases now where students are using the sex much broader.
The label.
And it can be very confusing for us because we need to parse through details. Have you seen a definitional change on what is sex?
Well, it's actually always varied. And so you're right that I think that there are, plenty of people who have a particular definition, but the most famous paper in our field about this came out in 1999, and it was called "Would You Say You Had Sex If?" And it was a really controversial paper. It got picked up in tons of media. And the controversy around it was that even though the data had been collected in the early 1990s, asking college students, like, would they say that they had had sex if they had kissed somebody, if they had had oral sex, if they had had digital penetration, if they had, vaginal sex, anal sex, whatever. The controversy was that it was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in the midst of the Clinton-Lewinsky issue, when so much of that hit around was oral sex considered sex.
Absolutely.
And it turned out that, some college students considered it oral sex, but many didn't. And since that time, there have been so many studies on this topic, and my colleagues and I have published some of them years ago, involving same-sex, couples and, people who identify in various ways of their sexual orientations. I was at a conference probably 7 or 8 years ago where some medical students did a really neat thing to see what physicians in training think of as sex. And it turns out that physicians in training largely think of things that could, cause STIs to be considered sex, but other things aren't sex to them. So you're right. I mean, it varies by people's, by their gender identity, their sexual orientation identity. It can even, vary based on again, like if somebody's like a medical provider or not. So there's lots of variations in what people consider sex. And the research on that, again, going back many years, even shows that it varies based on whether it's like with somebody's partner or not. So sometimes people might say, like in cheating with somebody, well, that's not sex because ... 20 years ago, when I was doing a study, I was working as an assistant on somebody's study a good 20 years ago in my graduate training. And I remember interviewing these teenage girls, about their sexual partners. And we had to go through and how recently have you had this kind of sex, whatever, all these different behaviors. And we would ask about different partners and the number of partners. And it turned out she gave me a certain number, let's say 2 partners. But as the interview went on, later on, she mentioned this third guy who she hadn't mentioned before. And I said, well, wait a minute, this person didn't come up before. You said there were 2, but now you're mentioning this third one. And she's like, oh, well, that wasn't good. And we're not talking anymore. So, and to her, what she considered a sexual partner was it any good? To other people I interviewed, if it didn't last long, if it was 10 seconds and then the sex was over, it didn't count. So,
oh my gosh.
So people, and that is why it is so important, as you're saying, especially if the issues are really important around what did or didn't happen, we actually have to ask really specifically, because if we just say sex, people, that word means so many different things to so many different people.
The charge
many things to many people. Yeah.
That's a good one.
Debbie, I'd like to switch gears a little bit. In Yes, Your Kid, we talk about hopefully the goal of being an askable parent. And so meaning not, you don't necessarily always have the answer, but you sort of create a safe space for your kids can come to you. So in the spirit of being an askable parent, I mean, realistically, what do you think parents can offer their children in terms of partying and safe sex?
So they'll listen.
Drugs and alcohol.
Drinking, binge drinking. What can you say that they're not going to roll their eyes?
Well, I think so. Everybody's starting from a different place, for one thing, right? So I think wherever you're at as a parent, it's important to know that you can take a step toward being more approachable and askable. And that's going to look really different for lots of different people. And we had some of these conversations while writing Yes, Your Kid, right? Where
we did.
For many parents, since their kids were very young, it's very comfortable to talk about what parents use for birth control. I have a, colleague who's a urologist, and her husband's a urologist. And when he had a vasectomy, they had a vasectomy party for him with their 3 kids, and it's that's really
interesting, huh?
Okay. I mean, and they posted photos on Twitter, and it was so fun. And it was sort of the dad had a shirt about how he was retiring his swimmers with little pictures of sperm, right? That's not going to be most families.
No.
But, as I sort of asked my friends who weren't in the field, I said, do your kids know what kind of birth control you're on and stuff? And has this ever come up? And it turned out that most had that come up, but some hadn't. And the ways it came up were sometimes in the most typical ways, like, oh, well, I had to like pick up my prescription at CVS for my pill. And then my kid asked like, well, what is that? So wherever you're at, there is space to create a comfortable situation. So you're asking specifically about like partying, like drugs and alcohol and sex. And, again, depending on what your kid is like and what their age is, whether they're 14 or 17 or 24, there's going to be different conversations. But, a home base for many parents is, look, my job is to give you information to help keep you safe. And so it's important to me that you hear blank, 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 whatever that is for that, again, that age, that stage, that development. I think wherever families are at too, I often say that it's helpful, and this has been helpful for me with my kids, is I'm not trying to keep you from having fun. I'm not trying to keep you from being independent. I want you to grow up and be more independent all the time. My job is to give you this information here. And I take that same approach with my college students, right? Like, it's not my job to control their lives. It's not my job to shame them, but it is my job to give them plenty of information so that they can make choices, understanding what the potential consequences may be. And that there's a lot of research in parenting on research on drugs, research on parenting conversations around alcohol, and also research on parenting conversations with sex. And they all come to the same thing, is that one of the most helpful approaches is that you are informational. So you provide lots of information. You make it clear that you're there to support them. But you are not the only one making the rules, right? And every family is going to look different, but that you come together to figure out what your rules are for your family. And they're going to look really different from family to family, what those rules are. But that's part of working together as a family and discussing sex and discussing values and discussing boundaries and safety.
If I, looking back on the book process, so I have something for both ladies. What was your favorite part of writing this book that you really want to share for our listeners to tune in on? What chapter, what thought? And if you were going to do another book, what would your next topic or focus be?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah.
Good question. Well, I would say I am a mother to 2 children, and my children are a bit younger. And so I just really enjoyed the opening chapter on being an askable parent and sort of giving me some tips and food for thought in terms of how to, especially as my daughter gets older and it's time that we need to have more, let's just say, sophisticated conversations about sex and life. I thought it was it was helpful. It resonated with me. And I think that I'm grateful that we have that chapter in the book. And I hope that many of our listeners buy the book and also sort of can appreciate that chapter. And it's sort of an entree into having these tough conversations in homes around the country and hopefully around the world. If I wrote about something else, I got to think about that one. Debbie, what about you?
I mean, I love the early chapters on askability too, because I think they matter for parents of kids of all ages and stages, because everybody's growing in some way. And some of our later chapters, around pornography and sex and technology and rough sex, even for families who have talked about the basics, those might be newer for them. And so going back to some of those basics and thinking, how do I do this, can really help. Our chapter on the rise of rough sex is personally really meaningful to me because my college students are grappling with that all the time. And I know that most parents have no idea that that's even a thing. And so I really, really am excited to get Yes Your Kid into parents' hands so that they can be aware and think, how do I talk with my kids about their health, about their safety, about their partner's health and safety, help walk them through and navigate a really, really tricky terrain. As for books, as you mentioned, I've written several other books. I take one at a time.
It's a journey. Yeah.
It's a journey.
Susan, what about you?
Well, I have to say that I will always have a very special place in my heart when we talk about sex on the spectrum because so many parents who have neurodiverse children feel cut out of the sex conversation. And they feel like their children they'll never get to be able to have, it's like a luxury question that they're not going to be part of when all the neurotypical parents are thinking about birth control and proms and dating, and to be inclusive and to recognize that, there are students on the spectrum with the same sexual needs for love, belonging, and touch. And there are some that don't want to be touched. And to really pay attention to that population was deeply meaningful to me. And it's a chapter just talking about it, I get very choked up about.
I know you fought hard for that chapter as well, and I'm glad you did. I think it really is important and meaningful, and hopefully it shares information for a lot of families that are searching for information on these types of topics.
Absolutely. And I know that I do think we joke, Kristina, would we ever do it again? Because writing a book is truly a commitment. And I know that you could tell that you gave us a deadline, Debbie, and we're like, okay, we will meet that deadline. And that's just how we work. We really try to be punctual and fit it into our law practice and our personal lives. And it is such a labor of love. And then I look at the book, the copies are on our desk, and I still can't believe it. But I, and I want to talk to you about this, Debbie, because it's something that's growing in our practice, is that we are seeing more students really struggling with mental health disorders and how that impacts their sex life. And we're seeing a rise of students with bipolar disorder and anxiety and depression. And I think that if there was another chapter inside of me or another book to come, I'd really want to explore that. So I'll give it away. That would be where I want to go next.
I think that's an excellent idea, and certainly a space where, particularly post-pandemic, there's so many struggles that students are navigating. And let's face it, sex is already kind of complicated and tricky to navigate. And so you throw anything else into the mix, much less mental health struggles, it can sort of it can get very difficult. And certainly I think that we're always a fan of providing accurate information to help support students.
And it's really great that we were able to, by luck, meet up with you, Debbie.
Absolutely.
And upon you. And I think that's one of the things that makes our law practice different, is that we don't just talk to lawyers all day. We talk to esteemed colleagues who are professors and writers and researchers and therapists. And that's what brings a sense of diversity in our own thought into our lives. So I just want to thank you for bringing us into your fold.
Thank you, Debbie. It really was such a treat engaging in this project with you. And we're really so appreciative of your knowledge and expertise and all the work that you do to educate not only students, but also the world about sex. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. And I learned so much from working with you both. And I think for anyone listening who hasn't had the pleasure of working with you both, I mean, some of the things that I also learned about how you work and respect so highly about how you work were your stories of not just dealing with the legal situation at hand, but all the other resources and support that you provide students and their families. I can think of times when you talked about certain cases, and yeah, I mean, for some of these students, we really need to help them with like time management skills and, and like learning how to like function well in their executive function. For other clients, you were, masters at helping them to find resources around like social skill development or helping with substance use issues. And all of these do intersect with relationships and sexuality. So none of these things happen in a vacuum. It's like you said with mental health, they're really interconnected. And I really appreciate your strong advocacy and care for young people as whole human beings. And that really comes through in your work. So thank you for letting me have the chance to work with and learn from you as well.
And everybody, the book can be found on pre-sale on Amazon.
And many other
And
booksellers as well.
Everywhere books are sold.
Everywhere books are sold, you will find Yes, Your Kid by our main author, Debby, and my wonderful, fabulous co-author, Kristina Supler.
It was a pleasure working with both of you. And Debby, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for listening to Real Talk with Susan and Kristina. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And leave us a review so other people can find the content we share here. You can follow us on Instagram. Just search our handle @StoneSupler. And for more resources, visit us online at studentdefense.kjk.com. Thank you so much for being a part of our Real Talk community. We'll see you next time.